All right, that one's working at least.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. So we'll just cover a couple of quick basics really fast before we bring up our wonderful guest speaker for this evening. As I said before, make sure you sign in if you haven't. I can't, it just doesn't work for me very well. Anyway, as we're progressing through, Anne is a fantastic resource for us tonight. She's from UF's Shimberg Center, which is just across the way in the College of Design, Construction, and Planning. And she has spent a very long time doing a lot of research into what we would call the affordable housing issue. And you can thank her for a lot of the resources I gave you in the packet, as well as the data clearinghouse that the Shimberg Center has, where it allows you to break everything down by county. So she's gonna cover Florida's affordable housing needs. Oh, by the way, before I forget, there is that meeting with the city of Gainesville on February 20th I had emailed all of you about. And we'll be speaking here still. Do they have you on? Well, I think she may be there. And I know be there. For Alachua County, of course, is good. But for the rest of you, this would be a good opportunity to go. Even if you can't stay for the whole thing, sometimes these meetings do go on for quite some time. But it will give you an opportunity, though, to get a feel for how things are operating for your own county. Even though some of the specific issues may not be the same, most likely a lot of the issues that will be addressed in that meeting will be issues that will also be impacting your own county. So it would give you a sense of both the offices and folks of who are involved on this issue at the city and the county level, as well as an overview, again, of a lot of the ins and outs of these issues, which will help you become much more knowledgeable on the subject matter and ideally lead you toward sound or interview questions when you get there to construct that. So the way tonight will function, Anne's going to speak to you for a while, probably 45 minutes to an hour-ish. I think you mentioned you're okay if they ask questions in the middle.
Yeah, why don't you, if there's something you want to clarify, ask me then. If it's more a general discussion, let's hold off.
Right, and then what we'll do is at the end of her talk, we will open it up for Q&A. And this is a good opportunity for all of you to ask any questions that you may have. As I mentioned, she has been working on these issues and all over the state and at the county level. Is that a ring?
Yes.
Okay, are we okay? Do we know who lost it? Oh, that traveled far. Okay, good. All right, we're problem solving already. Good job. So she will be able to give you a lot of insight into the general sense of what's going on and what we think about on the ground, as well as give you a lot to think about as far as the what's going on in your own county that you may encounter. So please pay a lot of close attention to this and get your questions ready for her at the end so that we can address all of that. And with all of that, let me turn it over to Anne Ray from the Shimberg Center. I'm going to switch this on if you need it. We'll see how it goes.
How's that sound?
You guys all right? Can you hear okay? Okay.
Okay. Thanks, Kevin. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm so excited that you're working on this topic. Your time is good. To my mind, it's always good to work on affordable housing. This is an issue that's so near and dear to my heart. But I also think your timing is good because I've seen more attention to this issue at the county level in Florida in the past couple years than I saw in the 15 years before that. It's really something that's coming to a head. And I think that counties and local governments they're getting kind of tired to wait for somebody else to solve the problem, and they're stepping in and at least thinking about these things in a way they haven't before. And because you're getting them in some cases where they haven't thought about these things a lot before, you're finding them very much at the time when they're forming their policies as opposed to already having long-standing policies and programs in place. And so, you're in a really good position to have influence on what happens next. And it makes what you're doing not just interesting, but I hope really important. So the Shimberg Center, as Kevin mentioned, we're in the College of Design, Construction, and Planning. We're part of the Rinker School of Construction Management, and we are literally just around the corner If folks have questions and want to make an appointment to stop by my office, I'm happy to go over information with you. The center was founded in 1988 by the state legislature, and we serve as the state's affordable housing research arm. Since the year 2000, we've had the Florida Housing Data Clearinghouse, which is what I coordinate. That's a little bit of our website up there, our Data Clearinghouse website. And I know that Kevin's already offered that up as a resource to you. If we have time at the end, maybe we want to even do a demo of it so we can talk about what kinds of information are on it. If not, feel free to go through it and ask me questions about it. But before we get started, I did want to show a very short video that I think gets at a lot of the reason why we're here. Get that queued up.
So in 1990, well, I was living at Joseph Village, and it was pretty good there, but I ended up getting sick, and I ended up not working as much hours as I did. So I ended up being evicted for 1 month's rent. Well, I was living. So in 1997, my siblings and I, we lost our mom to a traffic crash. Sitting next to her in the bed, in the hospital bed, because she was in a coma for 2 weeks, trying to figure out, oh my God, what are we gonna do? You know, we don't have anywhere to go. This is it. And I had already promised her that I'm gonna do whatever I can to take care of my siblings. At the time I was 19, I had a son of my own who was about 6, 7 months at the time. And so what happened, I ended up with custody of my younger siblings, all 6 of them. So what ended up happening is I thought to myself, gosh, what can I do? You know, I knew I couldn't afford to buy a home. I was just not financially able at the time. Though I did know that owning a home would stabilize our family. I found out that there were funds out there to assist me in purchasing a home. And actually I was able to take advantage of those. I really truly believe in, and I know this probably will sound crazy to you, that purchasing my home helped stabilize our lives enough that I became a police officer. I'd like to think that my mom, she probably was really excited about the fact, and she probably was patting me on the back. I like to think that she looks down at us, and when we purchased a home, to see how happy, and knowing that she wasn't here through this process, but knowing that I did what I said that I was going to do, and I made sure that none of my siblings were left out. Like I said, they always have a place to call home if any of them need it, because this is our house, this is our home, this is ours.
Florida Realtors ask for your support in protecting the Affordable Housing Trust Funds. Let's stop raiding the trust funds and start helping those who need a hand.
I show this because this is a technical subject. I'm going to be talking about some technicalities and some bureaucratic things tonight. But what the affordable housing issue really is about people coming home. And Ms. Hyland's story didn't come about by accident. It came about because there was a concerted effort and there was involvement by local government, in this case the city of Tallahassee, to ensure that she and her family could come home. And so, even though I'm going to talk about some very daunting need and some daunting numbers tonight, in fact, every day, people are getting assistance and they're able to realize whatever that dream is, you know, whether it's owning a house, in her case, getting out of homelessness, finding a stable place to live. And so that's how important what you're doing is. I'm going to cover sort of some scattered ground tonight because affordable housing is a big subject, so I wanted to hone in on the 3 important things I'd like you to take away from this. One is that the root of the affordable housing problem is actually really simple. So simple that it seemed almost a little silly to type it onto a screen. And that's that there's a gap between the amount that many people can afford to pay for their housing and what housing actually costs. And that gap has been growing over the years. So the root of the affordable housing problem is that gap, the lack of supply to meet the the housing needs of the people who need it at a price they can afford. The second key point is that the way to address that, and the way it needs to be addressed at the local level, includes a continuum of housing types, is to create a housing system that meets people and the different needs they have in the different places they are in their lives. And that includes supportive housing, affordable rental housing, and affordable homeownership opportunities and assistance like what you just heard about. I'll go into what each of those means in more depth. And the third thing is that there's a lot of players in the affordable housing field, or in the housing field in general. A lot of this is done by the private sector. A lot of times it's thought of as largely a federal government responsibility, and in fact it mostly was up until about the 80s or so. But local government, and I'm going to use local, city, and county kind of interchangeably, because in housing, the larger cities, or the mid to large size cities, and the counties really play about the same role. But they really have three basic roles. They make the rules by which we develop land and develop housing. They spend the money that's available for affordable housing programs and assistance. Most of these things are administered locally. And sometimes, under some circumstances, they, local entities, public entities, directly provide the housing. And here's where things start to get a little bureaucratic. Some terminology that you might come across while you're out there doing your interviews, and also some of the ways that, the language that I'm used to using to talk about housing needs. Not up there, but a household. Housing needs are usually counted in households as opposed to population. So instead of looking at, the 250,000 people who live in Alachua County, we would more look at I think it's about 90,000 households. So that's everybody living in a single housing unit. That could be one person, that could be a big family, that could be roommates, people who are related, anywhere in between. But the household is usually the unit of measurement for housing needs. And housing tenure is the idea that people generally either own their housing or they rent it. There are some things in between. There are some people who are living in group quarters or a dorm or a frat house, and they're not part of a household at all. They're not counted in households at all. But in general, the main ways we acquire our housing is we own it or we rent it. And so you may see housing needs, and I usually talk about them divided between those two tenure groups. So, as a very blunt definition, a housing unit is usually considered to be affordable to a household if it costs no more than 30% of their household income. So you can see that the lower your household income gets, the less money you have left over to pay for other things after you pay for your housing. So we'll use the 30% standard. As I said, it's one instrument. If you have a lot of money, then 30% of your income is a lot to spend on housing, but also means you have a lot left over. But particularly in looking at lower income households, that 30% is considered to be an affordable level. A household is considered to be cost burden, housing cost burden, if they're paying more than that. So more than that for what? If you're a homeowner, that includes a mortgage, if you have one still on your property, or if you use one to borrow to buy your house. It includes property insurance, it includes the taxes you pay, and it includes all your utilities. And if you're a renter, that 30% includes both your rent that you pay to your landlords and any utilities you have left over that you have to pay. Because those can really add up, right? So if you have a cheap housing unit but uses a lot of electricity and you're paying that electric bill, that's an inherent part of your housing cost. So if a household, particularly a lower income household, is paying more than 30% of their income for their housing, if they're cost burdened, they're very likely to have to start to skimp on other needs. Housing always has to be paid for in full. You can't pay part of your rent and expect to stay in your apartment. You can't pay part of your mortgage and expect to stay in your house. The author of the book Evicted put it, rent eats first. So after people's housing costs are paid for, if they're cost burdened, they may have trouble affording the other things you need. They may skimp on food, on health care, clothing, and transportation. And a number of households, again, particularly at the lower end, are severely cost burdened, paying more than half of their income for their housing. So if you see cost burden or severely cost burden, that's what those terms mean. And here's where things get very bureaucratic. In the housing world, we talk about income when we're thinking about whether people are in need or whether they're eligible for programs in terms of the percentage of area median income. You don't write it down, you'll get the slides, and also these different levels are on our website. But the way how income as a percent of area median income works So for housing programs, you do usually have to be income qualified in order to get a benefit. And it's not done by a flat dollar amount. It's not saying every household that earns less than $50,000 is eligible for this benefit, say. And it's not done the way many social programs are done, which is looking at what percentage of the poverty line, or the federal poverty level the household is at. Instead, we have this kind of convoluted system where we look at income as a percentage of area median income. And that adjusts both for the size of the household, so a household with more people in it tends to have more wage earners, more money, but also needs a bigger housing unit. And it's also adjusted for where you live in the state or the country, what metropolitan area you live in, or a county if you're in a rural area. And that's because incomes vary from place to place. So what you need to get by in a rural county with a lower income might be quite different than what you need to get by in an expensive urban county. So you don't have to memorize any of that. If you see extremely low income, you're usually referring to households up to 30% of area median income. Very roughly tracks the federal poverty line. If you see up to 60% of area median income, which is the cutoff for many of our affordable rental housing programs, that's about double that. So it's very roughly, depending on where you live, double the federal poverty level. And then the numbers go up from there. Generally, our housing programs are either aimed at extremely low-income residents, the most deeply subsidized housing, rental programs at this very low income limit, homeownership more at these low and moderate income limits. Anyway, you don't need to know any of that except that all these, for every county in the state on our website, we have these different numbers, these different income and eligibility numbers adjusted by family size. Okay. As I mentioned, those income levels and cost burden are a way to characterize need. You can take a look at this graph on your own if you want. The important things to get across is those bars represent households. All the bars in red are households that are paying more than 30% of their income for their housing in the state of Florida. About 2.5 million, more than 2.5 million, which is about a third of all the state's households. Not surprisingly, the lower income levels are much more likely to be cost burden. And in particular, most low-income renters pay more than they can afford for their housing. And that's a change. I mean, that's always been true for people at the lowest income levels, but that cost burden has started to creep up the income stream as incomes and rents have really diverged. So housing costs over the past 2 decades have risen much faster than household incomes have, particularly for renters. So any questions about that? Does that make sense? It makes sense because it's not that mysterious. Rents have outpaced, rent growth and owner costs as well have outpaced gains in wages. So think about that 30% standard again. Suppose you had one person in a household and they wanted to rent a typical 2-bedroom apartment in the state of Florida. With their utilities, that's going to cost them over $1,000 a month now. Somebody, that individual, would have to earn $21.50 an hour in order to only pay 30% of their income for their rent. And somebody who's making Florida's minimum wage, if they wanted to only pay 30% of their income for that $1,000+ a month, they'd have to work 104 hours a week. So clearly, employment on its own is not enough to bridge the housing gap. And in fact, we've heard a lot of talk recently about raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, which would really help to close that gap for a lot of people and narrow it. But it still doesn't actually hit. A $15 an hour job still doesn't hit what you would need to pay less than 30% of your income for that $1,000+ a month apartment. To bring that to the Florida level, you could, again, if you're getting these slides, it's probably easier to read if you're looking at it on your own screen, but there are a lot of jobs in Florida that pay less than $21.50 a month an hour on average. And this is just a list of a few of them. What people could afford if they were to pay just 30% of their income for their housing. And then that fair market rent of almost $1,100 a month. So a cashier or a retail salesperson, they've got income, right? They could be paying, say, $500 a month comfortably for rent. But that's only half of what they're going to need for that $1,000 apartment. Going up to some jobs that pay more, you get people who might be able to afford $600 or $700. And most renter households do only have one working person. still below what they need for that 2-bedroom. And the people who are really at risk are the ones at the top of that graph, are the ones who are on fixed income. So somebody who can't work, who's receiving our federal SSI benefits for disability, they get about $750 a month for everything. So even if they put their entire check toward that apartment, and a 1-bedroom is I think about 800 something, they're still not going to be able to afford that housing. And a retiree who's getting Social Security, paying 30%, could pay a little over $400 a month. Again, well below what it costs. And that's pretty much it. That's a sort of easy to understand and difficult to address part of the story, is that there is this real gap, a real and growing gap between housing costs and income. Okay, take a second, make sure I'm getting what I meant to say. So, as I said at the beginning, this is a daunting problem, and yet every day there are people like Ms. Hyland who are able to solve it because of a local affordable housing system. And in fact, the solution to closing this gap is to come up with a continuum of housing options that meets people at different incomes and different phases of their lives with different challenges. And I should, looking at the left side of this, I realized one thing I did forget to say is that, of course, not everybody is able to bridge that gap. There are over 2.5 million households who are cost burdened, about a third of the households in the state. But we estimate that there's also over 28,000 homeless single individuals in the state, and almost 44,000 homeless families with children. So people who have been unable to bridge that, or even to spend that huge amount of their income and remain in housing. Those numbers are probably underestimates, but to the best of our ability, using data from a one-night count that's done of homeless people, and also data that school districts collect on their students. That includes people who are literally homeless, who are sleeping outside, who are in shelters or transitional housing. It also includes a lot of people, particularly families, and youth traveling by themselves, who are doubled up with other people. They're couch surfing, they're living temporarily with family, or sometimes, particularly in Central Florida, in hotels and motels. So when we look at these counts of households in need, there's also a huge group of people who are not in housing at all. And that's maybe a different situation than somebody like Ms. Hyland, who is trying to keep her family together and was looking to buy a home. And that's the idea of the supportive housing continuum, is that the solution to closing that very large gap at the local level, and any of these local governments should be able to give you similar statistics just for their area, is to develop a local affordable housing system that meets the needs of people at different incomes, at different stages of their lives, and who are facing different challenges that are keeping them from being stably housed. So Ms. Hyland is looking to buy her first house. Somebody who's working in retail and has that $500 a month to spend might just be looking for a decent rental unit in a safe community that they can afford at that lower rent. There might be older people who are looking to downsize. They might need some help with daily living activities, and so they're looking for a small place that they can afford on, remember, it was a pretty modest Social Security check, and that also provides services for them. And I'll tell you what I've heard more and more out in the community from my peers is, my kid wanted to move back after college, found a job, but couldn't find a place to live where they grew up. I think one of the things that has brought this issue to so much local attention is that the generation that's making the policy is looking at their own children becoming young adults and not able to stay in the Florida communities where they grew up that used to be relatively affordable. Or they've got an opportunity in a new place and they can't move there. In fact, the head of a major affordable housing nonprofit in Miami, who had worked in the field for decades, moved to Nashville. She retired and she moved to Nashville. And when asked why she retired, she said, it wasn't because I wanted to stop working. It wasn't because I wanted to leave Miami. It's because my two sons, who were both teachers, couldn't teach in Miami-Dade County, find a place to live. So they moved to Nashville where it was cheaper, and I don't want to be apart from my grandkids. So there are a lot of personal stories that underlie these numbers. This is going to probably be a bit of a challenge in your project. It's a challenge in my work, is when you talk to people locally affordable housing may mean very different things to them. So in Palm Beach County, for instance, one of the most expensive counties in the state, half of the houses that sold last year sold for more than $350,000. In Palm Beach County, a $200,000 house is very much a relatively affordable house. But it might as well be on the moon for that person receiving SSI or somebody working a very low-wage job. It's really far out of reach. And so I think when you're out talking to folks, it's important to pay attention to what they mean when they say affordable housing. And this continuum was my attempt, actually in part getting ready for that meeting on the 20th, to try and bring some order to that conversation. That a healthy local affordable housing system pays attention to each of these parts of the spectrum. So let's go through them one at a time. Farthest to the left, serving the people that are the most in need, is supportive housing. This is actually a relatively new concept, dating mostly back to the 1980s, that the way to address homelessness, people with severe challenges that keep them from staying stably housed, or older people who might need some support, people with mental or physical health problems who need some support in their home, can access supportive housing, a combination of very, very low-cost rental housing and services, case management, maybe substance abuse treatment, things, ideally close by or right there on the site to address the root causes that are keeping them from being stably housed if there's something besides just the fact that they don't make enough money to stay stably housed. And supportive housing has been shown to be a really successful strategy in getting people off the streets. The way that the typical strategy before was, somebody would need to live in a shelter and sort of graduate to be housing ready. Okay, you can move in, if you're homeless, you can move into a new apartment. You can move into an apartment, but first you need to be sober. And you have to have a job. And you have to have whatever benefit checks are supposed to be coming to you already coming, and sort of get housing ready. And then you can move into an apartment. What they were finding was that people couldn't take all those steps when they were living in a shelter or on the street. The flip side is people have been much more successful if you get people into housing first, even if you've got all these things going on in their lives. And having a home, knowing where they're going to lay their head, really helps them remain stable and helps them address those other issues. So supportive housing is a really important strategy in combating homelessness or ensuring that people with kind of multiple challenges besides just low incomes are staying stably housed. And then kind of in the middle of that continuum, we have a range of types of affordable rental housing. These include the traditional public housing program, which dates back to the 30s, publicly subsidized, so federally subsidized and locally publicly owned housing for very low-income households. It includes the federal voucher program, sometimes called the Section 8 program, that allows people to take a voucher to a private landlord and have their rent subsidized so that they pay no more than 30% of their income for their housing. In fact, that's where the 30% standard comes from. It includes a newer generation of subsidized housing that's both federally and state funded. That in Florida dates back to the 1990s, where Florida Housing Finance Corporation, the state's housing finance agency, provides both our state's housing trust fund and federal money to subsidize housing for new construction and rehabilitation of affordable rental housing, not at that really deep affordability level of public housing, but well below market rates. And again, also those are income restricted. And then a term you might hear come up, NOAA, or naturally occurring affordable housing, is kind of a new acronym out there on the scene that refers to market rate housing. So it's not subsidized in any way. It's just modest housing. So because of its age, or because of its condition, or because of its location, rents for less than what a new development would. And just as an aside, we don't really have a way right now to develop brand new affordable rental housing. In the past, there's always been some form of rental housing that's been newly constructed, that's been relatively affordable. So in Florida in the 60s through the 80s, say, there were a lot of duplexes built, or small multifamily apartments, very modest, that provided some relatively affordable housing, even though there's no subsidy involved. We don't really have a housing form like that right now that's being newly built. Most of what we build is either luxury housing or a certain amount of subsidized housing. And so a lot of times NOAA, naturally occurring affordable housing, refers to older housing. And then kind of on the right side of that continuum, there's a lot of ways for people to become homeowners and to get help. And that's what Ms. Highland did in the video. One is that there are some programs where people pay a lower price for their house in exchange for restrictions on what they can sell it for later. So like the rental housing programs are both income and cost restricted. Ms. Highland received down payment assistance from the city of Tallahassee, which was money that came to the state's housing trust fund. There's low interest loans, I believe you mentioned that too. So banks might receive funding from the state or through their local government to lend money at a subsidized rate, so people are paying it back at a lower rate. Sometimes for home ownership, maybe not as much for rental, we do build affordable or subsidized construction. So Habitat for Humanity is a good example of that, where they're building individual homes at a cost that's considerably below what the market would bear. But there's other nonprofits and local governments doing that as well. And finally, there's a lot of low-income people who are already homeowners who need help keeping their home in good condition so they can stay there, particularly elders. And so a lot of local housing programs provide weatherization assistance, home rehab assistance. They provide, help building a ramp or making housing accessible. So a home, when you own it, not only includes all the costs of paying off your mortgage and all that, but it also includes a lot of maintenance costs. And so a lot of local affordable home ownership programs focus on keeping existing homeowners their housing in good condition. And one of the purposes of showing this as a continuum is that all these pieces are related. For the system to work, you really need all of them. So people aren't going to be able to qualify to be homeowners and move into affordable home ownership if they've been paying so much of their income for the rent that they're never able to save up for that new home. People with a housing voucher are never going to be able to go out there and use it unless there are relatively affordable and sometimes even supportive housing available. People in supportive housing aren't going to be able to move on to these other steps unless they get the services that they need and kind of stabilize their lives, and often might be able to move out into sort of a more regular housing market. So I would say that a healthy local affordable housing system, as I've said, really needs all of these pieces. And you're not going to find a system out there that has all of them, and you're certainly not going to find any that has enough of any of them. But I think it's interesting to ask the officials you're talking to where their systems fall on this continuum, what pieces they have in place and what they don't, and what pieces they think are more important for their particular community. So any questions about that? Okay. I mentioned before that there's really three things that county and cities do in affordable housing. Affordable housing is definitely a very fragmented responsibility. So as an alternative, think about public education, where the state of Florida actually has a constitutional amendment that says that public education is a paramount responsibility of the state. There's really no question about where the buck stops with education. That's kind of one of the simplest cases, even though we also have private actors in education. Of course, education is provided locally, and there's some federal oversight. But housing kind of flips it on its head, where most of our housing really, and most of what's done with housing is private. A lot of times there's government working in there, sometimes in ways that we don't necessarily perceive. For affordable housing, up until the 80s, as I said, most of the money came from the federal government. Since the 90s in Florida, a lot of the money's come from the states. States kind of pulled back. And so local governments are taking on more responsibility. So you'll hear about different folks doing these different pieces of affordable housing, but what are counties or cities doing in Florida? The one you'll hear about the most is that they make the rules for how housing and land are developed and used in their communities. So counties and larger cities set their own zoning policy, so they decide where housing can go and what kind can go where. There are rules for how big a lot has to be. There are rules for how much parking you have to provide. There are all kinds of rules that a developer might say would drive up the cost of housing. And a lot of the local attention to bringing housing costs down has really focused on these regulatory barriers. So how do you make housing more affordable by allowing more different types of housing, by allowing smaller housing, by allowing more housing on less land? And Something that's often talked about and often proposed and only sometimes passed is inclusionary zoning, which would take things a step further, kind of flip the how do counties and cities make housing more expensive on its head, and have counties and cities require affordable units, income and cost-limited units as part of new development. Tends to be it's often talked about, very controversial, only sometimes passed. And part of this fragmentation of county and cities' responsibilities is that housing is also sort of flung around a lot of different departments. There's often not one single department or entity within local and county government that deals with housing. So for the make the rules piece, the planning or the growth management department typically is who is in charge of that process. And so when you're going out to do your interviews, you're probably going to talk to a few different people who take these few different pieces. Sometimes they're all working together, and sometimes they're even one department, often they're not. A couple key documents that you might want to take a look at to see how the county or the city you're looking at is making the rules. Their comprehensive plan, which includes a housing element that really lays out their goals for how they're going to use land and develop. The local housing assistance plan, which is part of their counties and then larger cities' housing departments, also is required to describe how they're going to reduce regulatory barriers that rival housing costs. So, but the comp plan might be a good place to look, or at least pieces of it, for how the county is making the rules about housing. These all really affect this whole spectrum, from supportive housing all the way over to home ownership. I would say particularly the affordable rental and home ownership sides of the equation, because they're really not so much about what services are provided, but they're about how land is developed. Another thing that counties and cities do in affordable housing is they spend the money. It's often money that's been passed through from the feds at the state. Most of it will be. Some of it might be raised locally. And so counties and larger cities receive federal funding, most notably the Community Development Block Grant, but different grants from the feds that they have choices about. And one of those choices is to use those funds, those federal funds, for affordable housing. The counties and the larger cities are also the major way that the state's Affordable Housing Trust Fund gets spent. If you remember at the very beginning of the video, when the story was done, there was a little political message, in this case from the Florida Association of Realtors, that said stop sweeping the state housing trust fund, or maybe stop sweeping the Sadowski funds. Florida has, or should have, the largest state affordable housing trust fund in the country. Just a few years after we were started, in 1992, the legislature passed the Sadowski Act, which established a special tax on real estate transactions. You might hear them talk about documentary stamp or doc stamp transactions. So every real estate transaction that takes place in Florida has a small tax on it that goes into an affordable housing trust fund, and has since 1992. 70% of those funds are passed back out to the counties and the mid to large size cities for their housing programs. And then the other 30% stays at the state, mostly to subsidize affordable rental housing development. The hitch, and the reason that there are videos being made to talk about how important it is not to sweep the Sadowski funds, is that the state legislature has to appropriate those funds every year. And there's nothing stopping them from sweeping them into general revenue and not using them for affordable housing. And that's what's been happening year after year. Well over $2 billion over the past couple decades have been swept from the Affordable Housing Trust Fund into whatever the legislature wants to fund. And so every year there's a campaign to keep the trust funds for housing. Some of you going out to talk to folks at the local and county level will undoubtedly hear that one of their priorities and one of the ways that they want to generate affordable housing in communities is to stop the sweeps of the funds. And so you might hear them called the trust fund. You might hear them called SHIP, which is the State Housing Initiatives Partnership. That's that 70% that goes to local programs. And you might hear them called the Sadowski funds, because that's the name of the act. Those are governed typically by a city or county housing department, which may or may not be part of the Department of Planning and Growth Management. So you may be speaking to different people about that. Here in Alachua County, for instance, they're two completely separate departments. A key document, again, is that local housing assistance plan, which will say how the money is to be spent. And generally, and shift dollars, the whole point is that since, local governments are closest to the ground, closest to what's going on in housing, they know best what types of housing, where on the continuum their community needs the most. The only rules are that 65% of the funds have to be spent on homeownership programs each year. And 65%, and these can overlap, they can be the same 65%, have to go to constructing new housing. But other than that, the cities and counties have a lot of options for how they spend their SHIP dollars, and that's laid out in this LHAP, or Local Housing Assistance Plan. So there's federal pass-through money, there's the state housing trust fund that they use, and generally, with some exceptions, counties and cities have not raised their own tax dollars for affordable housing. One big exception is Miami-Dade County, which actually had a dock stamp tax that was the model for the state program. Miami has a stamp tax and they have a trust fund. So the county is able to dole out county funds to subsidize housing. Broward County, just last November, the voters voted pretty overwhelmingly to create an affordable housing trust fund in the county, and they're looking for vehicles to fund that. So, this is something counties have really resisted. I believe Alachua County just put in its comprehensive plan for the first time that it plans to establish a trust fund somehow with some money. And that would be a really interesting thing to ask, and frankly, I was just put on the spot a little bit. Are counties looking at raising their own funds for affordable housing programs to fund really this whole spectrum? And finally, there are some local entities that act directly as housing providers. The major ones are public housing authorities, which are affiliated with local government but separate from them. Often they're some kind of creature of the state or local government, so they might have their executive director hired by the city or county, or they might have their board appointed by the city and county. But public housing authorities act as a vehicle, and we have over 100 of them in Florida, both city and county level, act as a vehicle to receive those federal funds, build housing, mostly up until the mid-'80s. There's some replacement housing, but very little new public housing being built. They administer the Housing Choice Voucher Program. And they may be very integrated into what's going on at the county. In Miami-Dade County, it's all one department. I guess they have separate growth management, but their housing department and their public housing authority is one entity. Usually they're separate. Might be talking to each other, might not be. But public housing authorities exist to administer these federal programs at the local level. And they really focus way on I would say on the left side of this continuum, providing deeply affordable rental housing, and sometimes getting into linking with service providers and getting more over to the supportive housing side of things. So I've kind of sprinkled these in, I think, through the conversation, but I do have some suggestions for things that I would be really curious to hear from the variety of people that you're going to be talking to, and particularly this geographic variety, where you're moving all throughout the state. One is, it seems to me like this issue is bubbling up to the surface more than it used to be. But are they hearing from community members that the lack of affordable housing is a problem? Is this an issue that's getting public attention in their community? And also, is this something they're hearing from employers? Talked about this mostly from a personal perspective. But employers who are in a community where there's no affordable housing available can have a lot of trouble attracting workers. You're seeing what's happening more and more with schools, for instance, really having trouble finding public school teachers because housing costs are so out of whack with what teachers afford. So, are they hearing about this from their constituents? I would suggest showing them the continuum and asking them how they're addressing these different segments, or if they're addressing these different segments of the continuum. What are their priorities along that continuum? What are their priority programs? And what would they do if they had more money available? Because housing is expensive. It really is a money problem. Remember, we talked about the root of the problem being the gap between incomes and housing costs. So of those different pieces, what would they do more of if they could? As I said, I'm curious about whether the county is raising any of its own local funds for affordable housing. And if not, either are local officials considering doing so, or is there any public movement to do so? And then a lot of the best things in housing bubble up from a local example. Somebody tries something interesting once, so the supportive housing some of the most interesting things that are going on in supportive housing right now are going on in the state of Utah, which really moved toward this housing first, getting chronically homeless people off the street. You know, supportive housing began as a strategy at the Times Square Hotel in New York, which is a hotel that was renovated as supportive housing for mostly men who were living on the streets in the city. So is there some model housing development or policy that they'd like to share, that they'd like to have the state look at? And I want to close by just suggesting a couple of resources. I think both of these were on the list you get, but I want to plug them a little more. This is a brand new website. It was just launched sometime in the last few months, localhousingsolutions.org, not ours. It's from a center like ours at New York University and a partner that they're working with. And it's a very comprehensive list of affordable housing strategies that can be implemented locally. And there's all kinds of, there's sort of like quizzes and things you can take. If your community is like this, these are strategies that might work for you. If this is what you're concerned about, focus on this. So I think it's a compendium of possible solutions. They have done a lot of the work ahead of time for all of us. And I'll just finish by plugging our own site. We have a lot of data on our website about the demographics of households that need affordable housing. So how many owners, how many renters. We have a sort of sister site that you'll see at the bottom of our webpage that has information just about the housing needs of elders at the county level. We have information, we have a database of all the subsidized rental housing developments in the state, both public and privately owned, but publicly subsidized. And that information is available. You can do a search at the county level. We have projections of households and populations going out to 2040. So looking at how we expect communities to grow and change. And then we have a lot of information about the housing supply. What did homes sell for on average over the past, 20 years that the county you're looking at? How old is the housing? What size? And you can choose any of these topics and choose to look at a single county or as many counties and cities as you want and compare them. So there's a tremendous amount of information there. We just redesigned the site and we launched it, which makes it faster and maybe a little more complicated to use. So if you want to try it, we can demo it tonight if people want to. Otherwise, we want to give it a try. If you have any questions, just give me a call and shoot me an email. I'm happy to answer it. So.
Okay, thank you. Right, I said amazing. Questions. Let's just, raise your hand, throw questions out there. Now is the time to ask.
Yeah.
You mentioned that inclusionary zoning is often controversial. So what are some of the arguments used against inclusionary zoning?
Okay, so the question was, I mentioned that inclusionary zoning was often controversial. So what are some of the arguments against it? So inclusionary zoning, the grandfather of this is Montgomery County, Maryland, which began imposing inclusionary zoning requirements in the 1970s. And typically the way the program works is the way the rules work is for new developments of a certain size. Let's say 10% of the housing that's developed has to be affordable at, and then we'll pick some, percentage of area median income. So the argument's pro. So I'll give you both. The pro-inclusionary zoning argument is it's a way to disperse affordable housing throughout the community. So it's a strategy to combat the concentration of poverty. So we haven't even gotten into here, just the difference in housing costs in neighborhoods and amenities that are available in neighborhoods and how all that gets figured into a home price. So a big plus of inclusionary zoning is it provides affordable housing throughout a community, particularly in areas where it might not be available and where people are kind of kept from opportunities because there's not affordable housing available. Another thing is that it doesn't really require new public subsidy, right? So it's if you put affordable housing in each new development, then you don't have to bring a lot of public subsidy into the housing. And typically inclusionary zoning is supposed to come with some carrots as well as sticks. So participants in the program, the developers are allowed to develop more housing units. The housing can be more dense. And the idea is that the increased density, more units on the same piece of land, kind of brings back some of the profits that are lost. The arguments against it, one is that this makes the responsibility for providing affordable housing, really puts it in one spot, which is on the development community. So it's the argument you're shifting responsibility that's really a community responsibility onto just housing developers. There's the argument that it will chase off development. The developers will just decide not to build. I would say that those are the two main issues. And in fact, it's a tax on new development, which it is. It's asking new development to cover some of the costs of affordable housing for the full community. The counter argument to that is that the community has essentially created the value that's in this land. It's valuable for housing because there's a lot of public investment in it. And this is getting back to some of that public investment. There are voluntary inclusionary zoning programs where there are incentives to include affordable units, but they're not requirements. Those tend not to have that much of an effect. Our research has shown that they tend not to have much of an effect just because usually the incentives aren't strong enough. The other thing is a lot of times, and this kind of weakens the inclusionary piece of it, usually a community will have an option where a developer can pay a fee rather than include the units. And when that fee option is available, that's typically what developers will take. Which, on the flip side of that, has generated a lot of money for affordable housing in places that wouldn't have it otherwise. And they've done some really interesting things with those housing trust funds. So I would say the main argument against it is, the people who have to take on that burden, the developers, don't want to do so. Yeah.
I know that housing trust funds, state housing trust funds are the more popular means of gathering the money to afford housing. What are the barriers put on the individuals from accessing these funds?
There's not enough of them. So the question was, what are the barriers for individuals in accessing funding from a state housing trust fund? And really it's just that they're so oversubscribed, so there's going to be a long waiting list. And also, there's only, because there's only so much to go around, a county will choose priorities. And so what they really may need is down payment assistance, but what their community offers is home rehab assistance. Well, they don't have a house yet, so that doesn't do them much good. So I think the main barrier for people is just the shortage of money that's available. Now, we're not gonna, I'm sure somebody's calculated what would have happened if that $2.5 billion had been spent on housing instead of whatever it's been spent on. I should mention that the governor released his budget last week, and for the first time in I don't know how many years, a governor's budget includes full funding of the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. If that happens, it'll really be a new day. It's up to the legislature now. But yeah, I would say mostly there's not enough of them. Can you think of other things that might impede people, and this can go out to the group, from accessing those funds?
No, just like time.
And also they do tend to be for home ownership, not all of them certainly, but so people who aren't in a situation where they're getting ready to become homeowners or aren't already homeowners often are, as well served by housing trust funds as maybe some other programs. Yeah.
So my question is about land use regulations.
Mm-hmm.
So through land use regulations, cities like New York and San Francisco, they've really restricted the supply to such an extent that those cities have become among the most unaffordable in the country. And my question is to what extent do city and county governments in Florida restrict the supply of housing? That is, restrict the construction of new housing with things like density limitations, setbacks, other forms of zoning.
Well, that certainly has been the case. So the question was, how much has restriction on building held back the development of more housing in Florida? We're no San Francisco or New York or Seattle, and there are plenty of, Miami, I guess, is hemmed in by every place you could, but a lot of communities in Florida can certainly develop out pretty far in ways that might not be acceptable there. I know in Alachua County, it's funny, the first thing I did when I moved here was look at a possible inclusionary zoning policy for the county. They were interested in it. And they were finding that builders weren't building to the allowable density now. They said, well, we could let people build, 4 units an acre, and they would get some kind, we would increase the density they'd be allowed to build to if they include some units. So I said, well, are they building to the density they're allowed to build to now? No. So, a lot of housing, there's a lot of things where it's just as inexpensive for somebody to build a luxury unit as it is to build something smaller. So, right now the profits, I think, are in building bigger. I certainly think we should be looking at how to get more housing, not sprawling out, but coming in. But I think we should be cautious about overpromising what that will do for affordability. I think the jury's really out of it. So, for places that are looking, Minneapolis just basically abolished single-family zoning and will allow up to 3 units, I think, to be built on any parcel that would have been required to be single-family before. Is that going to generate affordable units? Maybe over the long term. I think they're thinking about that whole continuum, and new, smaller units fit maybe slightly on the affordable construction piece of that. So I think building more is probably necessary, but not sufficient. Yeah.
Is urban planning having an effect on affordable housing? Like, is building certain roads or estates actually affecting the housing prices in certain areas and making it easy to move forward housing? Or is urban planning not so effective at making it more difficult?
Say the last thing you said again, please.
Making it more difficult? So is urban planning building a highway in the town, or making it more accessible to go from the way to the town, making everything easier? Does that actually affect affordable housing as it's cheaper land further away from the city, or is there no real explanation?
Well, I think so. The question was how planning and urban development, patterns of urban development, and adding things like highways, how that affects housing affordability. What it allows is more development farther out, and often that tends to be cheaper, but that can really increase people's transportation costs. For a short time, gas was $3 to $4 a gallon. People were really starting to think about that. Gas prices came down, and there's less attention to it. But I talked about housing costs generally not supposed to exceed 30% of your income. There's some talk in policy circles about your housing plus your transportation costs not exceeding 45% of your income. So your transportation costs are essentially embedded in your housing costs. You can save a lot of money by being far out, but if you're paying that in gas every day to drive, 20 miles, drive for an hour to get to your job, you're not really saving that much. But sure, all kinds of planning, including planning for different for transportation alternatives, can change what people pay for that total cost of location. Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier about Central Florida having a big problem with homeless people that staying in hotels and motels. I was wondering why that was particular to Central Florida.
So the question was why Central Florida would have a particular problem or issue with people staying in hotels and motels. It's just because they have so many of them. So, this happens throughout the state. There's, wherever you go, there's often like an old motel or hotel that isn't attracting new tourism business, but it'll say it's available by the week, and people get stuck. They might be paying $1,000 a month to live in that hotel room, but because they have to pay that much just to keep a roof over their heads, they can't save up enough for, you need first months, you need last month, you need a utility security deposit. Sometimes people don't need that much help to get unstuck from that spot, and they're spending more than they would for an apartment. So, but there are certain corridors in Osceola and Orange County, the old tourist motels that have been overtaken by new Disney developments or whatever, where the stock is there. There's a lot of attention there, including the resort industry. Some people some philanthropists from that have really started to pay attention to that corridor, trying to get people housed and out of there. And the county is interested in redeveloping those areas for other uses. It's not the nicest thing to have a lot of really low-cost motels with a lot of people living there, but not a transportation corridor. So yeah, mainly it's because that's where the hotels are. Yep.
So a lot of counties in Florida typically have like urban centers, but also rural centers,
Mm-hmm.
kind of scattered around the county. So like particularly for me, I'm in Martin County.
Which county?
Martin County.
Mhm.
There's like Stewart and stuff, but there's like areas around it. So I was wondering if you have any insight into where like how much focus should be put on urban versus rural parts of the county in terms of like finding the issues in terms of rural housing.
So the question was, a lot of the counties have an urban center and then rural communities. I think that's a really good question. I'm not sure I got a good answer to it. I would ask them. I would ask the people that you're working with, is there a real big difference in housing costs? A typical form of relatively affordable housing in rural communities is mobile homes on land that might be owned by the person living in the home, or that might be rented. finding out what, so I think there's sort of affordable housing issues that are specific to rural areas that I would suggest you ask about. The quality of those homes, in coastal counties like Martin, whether they're ready for natural disasters and hurricanes, and whether there's, I know when I've talked to folks in rural communities about student homelessness, which was some research we did, they really talked about the lack of affordable transportation. People were stuck that they couldn't get childcare and transportation, so they couldn't get to work, so they couldn't get out of the hole they were in. So I don't know that one or the other, I think that's worth asking. Are there affordable housing issues that are specific to the rural areas? And, in some areas are pretty big concentrations of migrant farm workers. Are there issues of housing farm workers in the communities? So I would ask about both. Yeah. Actually, let me go to somebody else and ask them, I'll come back to you. Yeah.
You mentioned Governor DeSantis speaking of, and putting out his proposal on the Sadowski funds. What effect do you think full funding for that will have, considering it hasn't been fully funded in the past 10 years, and like you said, there aren't many programs there yet?
So the question was if the Sadowski state funds have kind of sagged in recent years, what effect would it have if you suddenly brought the funds back now? I think that each community does have a SHIP program, and they've been sort of limping along. A lot of these, they talked about her getting a low interest loan. Those loans are paid back, so the programs generate a little bit of income. I was concerned over the years when we really were putting, during the recession, when we really weren't putting hardly any money into the trust funds, that counties were going to start laying off staff, that the people with the expertise to run these programs are going to be leaving. I don't think we hit quite that crisis level, but that's mostly because I'm observing things here, and that's actually a really good question to ask if you're talking to a person from the housing department is, one thing to think about in studying not just affordable housing, but any issue at the local level is good policy really depends on having good people to work in government and to run things. And the question of how their capacity was affected by the dip in the funds, they have been coming back, and so about half the Sadowski funds were allocated last year, which wasn't great, but it's still better than nothing. So I would ask. I think that's a good question for them. Yeah, you had another one.
For that, in the spectrum, for the one in the middle, the affordable rental, do you think that rent control is part of that category?
If anybody did it. These subsidized housing programs effectively impose rent control. So there are caps on what an affordable housing program, what a rental unit that was subsidized can charge based on the funding that they got. I think it's time to, you're not going to find any takers out there, but I think it's time to reopen a conversation about rent control and rent stabilization. When we just simply cannot, without subsidizing rental housing, create affordable units. It's kind of analogous to the inclusionary zoning, where you're limiting the cost of the housing that's being provided on the private market. But I think it's maybe time to start talking about it again. Particularly in some of these markets where costs have just been astronomical. But you're not going to find too many takers out there. Yeah.
I know that you're discussing how occupancy, affects household income and therefore affecting some of these projects. But when planning for these affordable housing projects, how significant is the discussion on occupancy regulations for the state or county level?
What do you mean by occupancy regulations?
Yeah, so how many people can stay in what definition of a bedroom? How many people can stay in that bedroom or that room? How does that play into the conversation for affordable housing?
So the question is about whether restrictions on how many people can live in a particular unit, how that affects affordability.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's a good question. I actually haven't heard that come up that much. We tried to look at that a little bit for subsidized housing units, and we found that actually people tend to under-occupy them. They get one person living in a 2-bedroom place, and that's driving their costs up. So I don't know. I don't have a good answer for that. I do think that one of the things that drives rental housing costs up are people are renting more housing than they need.
Okay.
certainly in the subsidized rental housing stock, we build a lot of 3-bedroom units, and most low-income renter households are just 1 or 2 people. And so people are paying, they might want that.
Yeah.
People, we talked about what people choose. People certainly can choose to pay more than 30% of their income for their housing to get something that they wouldn't be able to get for less. But I think one of the ways we need to start looking at bringing costs down and building more modest housing is building smaller units so people aren't getting more housing than they really need. Yeah.
Is there a city or county in Florida that has tackled affordable housing well?
So the question is whether there's a city or county that comes to mind that's tackled affordable housing well. So the irony about working in this is the places with the most progressive housing policies tend to have the worst affordable housing problems. So I would send you guys all up to Boston to look at how they run housing there. But I mean, housing affordability is a nightmare in Boston. They just have a lot of depth of subsidized rental housing, and they sort of have some people who have won the lottery up there. I would say that in looking at places that have shown some leadership, I think there's been some interesting things coming out of Pasco County. It's not necessarily the largest places. They've shown a lot of leadership in the statewide affordable housing community. I think, the video came from Tallahassee. It seems like the city of Tallahassee has a lot going on. I think Orange County and Orlando have really been thinking about these issues a lot in the past few years. Orlando's kind of an interesting place because it really started out as a relatively affordable community that now regularly shows up as one of the least affordable, having some of the least affordable housing for its citizens in the country. Not because their housing is so expensive, they're no, Boston or Seattle, but because incomes are really low and because things have changed so much so recently and housing costs have gone up a lot. So that's a place where I think the county has thought, in particular, has thought a lot about affordable housing in the past couple of years. Maybe haven't implemented so much yet, but they're thinking about it. Miami-Dade is interesting and complicated, but certainly has a lot going on. Here locally, certainly there's much more. This meeting is happening in a week or two because there's been so much more attention to affordable housing from this particular city commission. And Broward, newly has some interesting things going on. So I don't know if anybody's, got it figured out, but I think there are places that are moving in that direction.
Any other questions? Oh, there we go.
Okay, yeah.
Can you talk more about nonprofits in this field and how they work? Like, is it with the government or do they do their own work by themselves?
Sure. So the question was how nonprofits operate in the affordable housing field. So we go back to continue your piece up. So nonprofits, I guess they really act in 2 ways. One, there's a lot of social service providers that are nonprofits. So they're looking at individual assistance. It might be a nonprofit that helps somebody figure out how to, use a housing voucher and go out and find a unit, or providing the services that go along with supportive housing. But there are also nonprofit builders of affordable housing. Florida has a relatively weak nonprofit real estate development sector. Something that's unusual about Florida is most of our subsidized rental housing is developed by for-profits. Overwhelmingly developed by for-profit developers. I used to live and work in Minnesota, and there weren't for-profit developers who were interested in doing affordable rental housing. So that really sort of fell to the nonprofit sector to get it done. But nonprofits are developers, and there are some incentives and state programs for funds like the trust fund to go to nonprofits rather than only for-profit developers, or for the two to partner. And they definitely can't do the work they do without government money. So in some ways, they're almost like acting as an extended staff of government, that the government isn't going to do everything by itself. It's in some ways contracting with nonprofits for services and sometimes to do development. A little less in Florida. The nonprofit development sector in Florida has focused overwhelmingly on homeownership programs. And so most places will have some kind of nonprofit developer of single-family homes, or a lot of places, maybe not some of the more rural ones. Rental housing, not so much. Yeah.
Is there a difference for how small
whether smaller counties should tackle this differently. I mean, certainly your options for densifying a smaller county and sort of building in and up are going to be different. There's going to be less of an appetite for multifamily development, which can lower costs. One of the good things about the SHIP program is that there's a guaranteed floor, no matter how, so that I should mention that the State Housing Trust Fund, the SHIP dollars, are distributed on the basis of population. But there's a floor. You can't get less than $300,000. So even the smallest county will, with the fewest people, will have some funding to work with to develop affordable housing. So I would say it changes how they look at development patterns, unless it's a community with a significant number of farm workers, because then there's a need for farm worker housing. There's often a need for multifamily farm worker housing. But I think it tends to shift things more in the direction of home ownership, home rehab.
Anything else? Are you guys feeling all right? Oh, go ahead.
So kind of along the same lines, if it's an area that is losing population over time, so there's like very, very low demand, how do you combat affordable housing if a lot of the tactics in other growing areas are, this inclusionary zoning that's based on new construction, or those types of strategies?
That's an excellent question. It's funny, we don't really talk about much about places in Florida losing population, because usually it's, there's 1,000 people there, moving in. But,
mostly discourse.
yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think then you really shift over to this kind of home maintenance drive. There's plenty of money to be spent on fixing up older houses, and particularly communities that are losing population tend to have an aging population as well. So I think addressing the needs of the older population are key. And I guess, I don't know how I mentioned it once or twice, I don't really know how I got through this whole thing without talking about the need to prepare communities for natural disasters. That is all anybody's talking about affordable housing right now. So not only are houses accessible and weatherized, but how are they standing up to wind? How are they are they in flood areas? I should have added that to the list of questions. I encourage you to do it. How is, in different counties, given whether they're on the coast or whether they're in areas that flood easily, is that something they're having to pay attention to? So I would say, it mostly depends on maintaining the affordable the housing stock you have. It's a good question.
I'll just add one more. I'm sure you followed a few months ago the G&V Rise proposal and the proposed changes to the comprehensive plan. So what was kind of your take on that? I know I watched a lot of the stream of the community meeting. It was very negative from a wide range of perspectives. So what was your take?
So I stayed out of the whole thing. But I would say my take is the city should have been able to articulate, this is how many units are going to get built, this is what they're going to cost. This is sort of like, if every developer who could takes advantage of this, this is how things are going to change. And if only the people we expect to take advantage of this do, this is how things are going to change. I think I would, in some ways, this, in my mind, was a response to GMB Rise, where they sort of started with one piece of that, one idea, one technique, and didn't talk about how it fits, even though I think that they said this is not going to be the end-all and be-all of affordable housing policy. They didn't talk about how it fit into an overall system. And me, even as a professional, I had trouble seeing how does this fit. I think if they had talked about, if they had put some more concrete description of what would happen under it in place and how it would be a benefit other than, density is good and we need more things besides single-family homes. And if they had been able to place it as part of an overall strategy, I think they would have had more luck. But, it was also sort of an object lesson, and don't launch something unless you know you have some, I wouldn't say never do anything that some people aren't going to like, but don't launch something until you're sure you at least have some public support.
Okay, I think we've made Ann talk long enough. Please join me in thanking her. Thank you. This is fantastic. She has given you a lot. So a couple quick things is, number one, she has already said that it's okay. I'm going to send you her slideshow from this evening. So I will send that out to everybody tomorrow. along with I recorded this as well so that you can have a copy of the talk, because there's so much in there. I think you are now all realizing, and as she just brought up, we didn't even really get to disaster preparedness, which again, as we talked about last week, is another big facet of all of this. So what I'd like you to do before you leave, check in with your mentors if they are here, and then I'd appreciate a few of you if we can solve a collective action problem. The chairs without arms have to get stacked onto these little rolling carts so that we can move them back in, if some of you wouldn't mind staying to help with that. Other than that, I see several of the mentors coming back in. That's it. We will meet back here again a week from tonight for the second lecture. Please again thank Ann Ray for coming. Don't be shy to reach out to her with other questions if they come up as you start delving into this. And that's it. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah.